Yes, and then just as a, and to keep myself in my own discipline, so to say, we do have an hour in overall, right? If I'm not mistaken, or less than that.
55 minutes.
55 minutes. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll speak for 15, 20 minutes, maybe max, so that we would have more of a lively discussion, I would hope. But I'll have to keep myself disciplined. I tend to talk much, so I'll try not to have a long, exhausting monologue for you guys. First of all, really, it's a pleasure to see all of you, to see the room at my university filled with young people, young students. Time flies. I remember vividly my own time at the university, and then it feels as if it was yesterday. Corruption, and then fight against corruption. It has become a buzzword over the past few years, pretty much globally, I would say. There's a lot of talk about the impact that corruption makes in terms of destructive impact on development of states, societies, development of economies, protection of human rights. But we all understand that beyond the buzzword as such and importance of the concept of fighting against corruption, if we look deeper into that concept, we speak about actual lives of so many people in so many countries. And then corruption has different manifestations. It can be seen and perceived differently in different countries. But at the core of it, what corruption represents in itself is a distortion of a level play field, so to say, fairness in which in any society, any individual could realize their potential. And that's as a minimum if we would speak about that. But then we see that in many countries, if the corruption is endemic, and especially if the countries have issues related with security, conflict, wars, then it's concerns profoundly the basic human rights when it comes to the security of the human beings, and then the freedom of not being violated in terms of their own personal space in that regard, and then even life in this regard. I come myself from the country that has been plagued by systemic corruption for many, many years. And it has not been an exception, but rather a rule, I would say, in the post-Soviet space in many ways. Soviet system itself was profoundly corrupt system based on the fake reality that was promulgated at that time as an non-existing but proclaimed socialism, so to say, in the way, inequality among everybody that was proclaimed in the system that was profoundly corrupt in itself and oppressive when it comes to the freedoms at the individual level. And the legacy of the Soviet Union maintained its own impact on young democracies that have emerged at the time when the Soviet Union dissolved. But that was combined, in addition to that, with very weak institutional capacities of the newly emerging republics at the time. That was a very fertile ground, I would say, or environment at the time for emerging semi-governmental actors at that time, organized crime groups, vested interests, people who at that time managed to leverage their influences and then economic fortunes that they accumulated during the Soviet times into the new ways of impacting the development of the new republics. So in other words, Georgia, as well as Ukraine that I work in now, they all, and many other Soviet Union countries, they've suffered by what we call endemic corruption or systemic corruption. And if we speak about corruption at that level, I think it's important to realize, and that many of you, I'm sure, know from many backgrounds that you have from different countries, that the difference when we speak about systemic corruption with corruption as a problem that every society unfortunately faces is that it is indeed systemic. It's not an exception to the rule, but it is the rule, so to say. So that it's not that you have to fight with deviations from otherwise normally functioning public systems and interactions between public institutions, private sector, and civil society, but rather how you dismantle the system that in itself is profoundly corrupt and is sustained by schemes that intertwine political influences with economic ones through the corruption schemes in such a way that to some it might seem to be a vicious circle that cannot be penetrated. No, when it comes to what can be done to tackle systems of that kind, I think that understanding how complex those systems is important, so that tailor-made approaches to every country are being developed in such a way that ultimately two main pillars that have to be targeted on equal basis, I would say, tackling impunity through the system of justice, and then prevention of corruption by limiting the space for corruption spaces and ultimately eliminating systemic nature of corrupt schemes. They both have to be tackled at the same time in a comprehensive way, rather than thinking through the sequencing of actions that could be directed at that level. What I mean by sequencing is that I've seen it in many countries, in my own, and then in countries where I've assisted with the work on anti-corruption, that this question emerges frequently. Well, the situation is too cumbersome, too complex, so that why don't we try with something, and then step by step we enlarge anti-corruption efforts, so that at the end of the day we might achieve some sustainable impact when it comes to a successful fight against corruption. And time and again, what I've seen in my own experience is that if big loopholes or the gaps are left while some islands of improved practices emerging, vested interests are able to fight back and erode whatever results that could be achieved in the directions that could be temporarily successful. And I'll give you an example of what I mean to have it better understood, perhaps. Let's take a system of criminal justice. And if you have actors in three main domains, investigation, prosecution, and judicial system, all corrupt, let's say. And then the question is, we cannot change all of them together. So what do we do? Do we start with judiciary? Do we start with prosecution? Do we start with law enforcement when it comes to investigation, and see how through that we can tackle widespread impunity for corruption? And then we've had different experiments of that kind in different countries. Depending on the environments, sometimes it's judiciary that foreign actors, as they partners of any given country, so internal actors could opt for, saying that judiciary is the most important element, so we have to concentrate on that. If judges are okay, then everything else will easier fall into place, so to say, and becomes less corrupt or easier to be transformed and reformed. We've had that experiment in early 2000s in Georgia, for example, late 90s and early 2000s. And for a year or two, judiciary started to perform better after the new judges have been selected through the competitive processes. How salaries became a bit higher, but it all crumbled in about 2 years or so, because what happened was that the whole system was still profoundly corrupt. And when it comes to how cases we are getting to the court system through investigation, when they would start to investigate, and then through prosecution, how corrupt still the Bar Association was at the time in the country. At the end of the day, judiciary could not sustain itself as an island in otherwise systemically corrupt environment. So when after the revolution in Georgia from 2004, the new take was thought on how to fight corruption in the justice system, then we came to an understanding that we had to tackle it all at the same time, as much as we could. Otherwise, would not have sustained any results in this direction. So that while reform of the police was introduced at the time, pretty much almost in the same sequence, the reform of the prosecution service, and a bit later the reform of judiciary was launched by the government with the help of partners, and then projects funded by the donor community. And in that sense, one enabled to have a closed cycle, so to say, of reform that delivered better, rather than just tackling one direction while waiting for the results to emerge sufficient enough for that to pave the way then for more reforms that could have been introduced. Ukraine took a different decision in this case. Ukraine is a very large country, around 43, 44 million population, with quite a bit of elements of oligarchic governance that was at place, with a lot of liquidity in the economy historically. So conclusion was that we cannot change the whole system at the same time, but we better go in the direction of creating a specialized framework for anti-corruption efforts, specialized investigation body, specialized prosecution, and specialized court that would tackle high-level corruption cases. And if we have them really independent and effective, that could stimulate then and pave the way for the reforms on a larger scale in the law enforcement, prosecution, and then judiciary as well. And both are valid options, so to say. As I've said in the beginning as well, every country has its own specific environment. And in that case, it is extremely important to look into the nuances and then to understand what could work better in a particular country, rather than take as an example something that worked well in a given country, but cannot be replicated either at all or even in full in any other country where it worked perfectly, so perhaps previously. So in other words, law enforcement, prosecution, and judiciary, and in that sense, tackling impunity for corruption, especially high-level corruption cases, I would say is an inevitable part of overall fight against systemic corruption, because no matter what you do on the prevention side of corruption, and we'll speak about that a bit later as well, if there is no concept that is emerging in the society that corruption doesn't pay anymore, that there is higher cost if you go on that path, ultimately, rather than profits that you can get out of it. And on par with accountability, when it comes to transparency, accountability is achieved as well for those who violate the rules of the game, so to say, then there are better chances that the prevention mechanisms will be effective as well and will deliver the effect for which they are being created in this case. The new element in the enforcement part of anti-corruption equation that has emerged more and more now internationally is how proceeds of crime, and in this case, crime of corruption, can be tackled. Because it has been understood for quite long, but effective mechanisms have emerged more and more for the past, I would say, more than 1 decade, not even 2, when it comes to tracing assets, and then seizure of assets that are traveling globally, as we all know. It's very rare that you have proceeds of corruption staying in the same country where they are generated, especially if these countries are in the developing world. And it is a usual pattern that most of the proceeds of corruption travel in well-established, developed economies, so to say. We've seen now for the past few years many scandals emerging from different papers that have emerged. Pandora Papers are the latest in this equation, but all we see is that most of the proceeds, which are very large in terms of the scale, they travel internationally. They are in different offshores, but not only when it comes to the investments where they are ultimately lending. And it's not only proceeds of organized crime or trafficking or drug or any other crime-related proceeds, but then predominantly from corruption as well when it comes to international flow of illicit money, so to say. And in that regard, more and more we see that effective tools when it comes to seizure of unjustified assets, not only through the civil forfeiture, but then through the criminal proceedings as well, are emerging as the practice in different countries. Civil forfeiture is more widespread rather than criminal, but then it's a growing trend in which internationally countries in partnership, as well as donor community and countries in their own internal settings, are looking into the way how proceeds of corruption can be returned back to the countries, first of all, that they originate from, so that the justice is served with that for the societies and communities that have suffered for the corruption. But at the same time, they create that precedent that corruption does not pay off, so that it's not just a criminal accountability for corruption as a crime that you might be, ultimately held accountable for in your domestic setting or internationally, but Profits that you've generated are identified, they are seized, returned to the societies that suffered from crimes, so that it's not the case when some hidden assets still stay with your families and ultimately are to the benefit of those who have generated them. So that's a very important element of what constitutes now fight against crime. It's just the beginning of the process, as I believe so myself, especially with the new elements that relate to electronic currencies as well, and that's an emerging trend legally and then technically as well, to see how with bitcoins and other currencies of that type, illicit enrichment cases could be well tackled with. But this is a growing trend, and I believe that it will be more and more effective. We see that in the United States there is a growing interest into that as well. We've seen that Congress has undertaken very potent steps recently with the new bills that have been introduced, and some of them already approved by the Congress. But again, as I've said, this is just the beginning of the journey, because by all estimates and then all the information that is coming out more and more, this is a huge amount of liquid funds that are lending in the well-developed democracies and well-developed economies. And there needs to be a common solution that needs to be found for that. So in other words, it is not only how one tackles corruption in a country which suffers from corruption, so that the impunity is tackled, and then the precedent and culture that corruption does not pay off emerges in those countries, but then countries with developed economies and democracies need to be part of that equation, because as it appears so, most of the process of corruption travel in those destinations rather than stay in the countries that are plagued by corruption themselves, especially from high-level political leadership of those countries. Now, if we take away now our attention from impunity per se, which is more of a domain of criminal justice system, the landscape for what can and should be done for tackling corruption in the preventative side of a fight against corruption is immense in its own way. Because if you look into the framework how corruption works as a system, then apart from the pillar on impunity that it rests on, there are three main pillars if you look at it as well. So one is the legal framework in general, legal framework that is conducive to corruption rather than transparent way of operation of public institutions, service provision and administrative service provision to the citizens, and level play field for the businesses when it comes to the civil law and tax system and fiscal sort of relationship with the state that the businesses might have in this regard. Then weak public institutions. Most of the countries, or at least the big portion of the countries that have very serious problem of corruption, they are marked with very weak institutions as well when it comes to their independence and their effectiveness and efficiency. And it can be manifested in different ways. There could be different historical backgrounds to that, but it's a common feature that in most of the countries you see that effective and efficient, well-developed, strong public institutions tend to be more immune and at least more effective to mitigate risks of corruption, because they have that value set and capacity to do that rather than big institutions. And because of that, countries who are in transition, they have to do more to strengthen their public institutions in the way that they could be guided with values and principles that ultimately could establish transparent and accountable systems based on integrity. And then final big pillar for corruption systems is public tolerance to it. And it's a very interesting beast, because if you have public opinion polls in any country, at large, public will always say that they fight against corruption is the big priority for them. And there is, I at least have not come across to any precedent when in any society, public opinion polls would show that people are okay with corruption. They see a benefit even in it, or anything that is more or less okay if that is maintained. Openly in all countries, predominantly at least, you always see that fight against corruption, if corruption is a problem, it seems to be the top priority. But if you dig deeper, and there are different techniques how you do it, obviously, including through research and then sort of collection of data of behavioral patterns, you see that different degrees of corruption could be still tolerated by the society. And again, there could be different reasons of that. Part of the reasons in some countries is that this is the way how they can get by, so that they solve the problems that they have, so that not everybody can be a hero, right? In their own understanding when they ask for that. So if your child needs to get an education or medical services, and it's the only way for you to have been engaged in petty corruption, then parents do it, or I don't know, the children do it for their parents. And this is this vicious cycle of psychological approach to it. So if that's the only option, then what else can I do, right, in this case? But this needs to be understood that when reforms are starting, and then when actual results are emerging in mitigating the corruption risks, and then having transparent systems that are emerging, how important it is to communicate about that with the public. And I don't speak here about some positive propaganda when you don't have anything to sell and you are trying to sell to the population that something is good, but you don't have to take it for granted that everybody understands that it's better now, or you don't have to bribe anybody. But in fact, you might be committing a crime if you will continue to bribe anybody, because it will be not only be a crime, but will be detected effectively now, because the systems are emerging which are responding to that. So educational activities, civil society, strengthening of civil society that could deliver that message more effectively, to be an advocate of the changes, not only for demanding changes, but then actually sustaining the results of changes if they're emerging. This is an extremely important element, because what we've seen in many countries in the post-Soviet space, we see that any good result that emerges in countries that are, for example, attacked by Russia for geopolitical reasons, there is whole set of misinformation and malign influence activities and campaigns that are ongoing in these countries to undermine trust and credibility of anything positive that is emerging, because with that one still maintains the distrust towards the state, and then some positive developments in terms of social contract that could be emerging based on trust between the society and then the states in that regard. And in some cultures, you have different understanding of what constitutes corruption as well. Like my own country, for example, previously, if anybody would give a hand to a relative or a friend in finding the job or some better opportunities in businesses, the nepotism of that kind, or distortion of the market, so to say, when it comes to the business-related relationships, was not really considered, if one was honest, as a corruption per se, as something that was that was sabotaging basically a proper development in the country. And it took quite a bit of effort to install a different, so to say, or help to develop a different approach to that, so that giving that helping hand to your relative would have been understood that it's a nepotism, and that basically what you consider to be a giving opportunity to somebody that you know is taking away opportunity for somebody who might have deserved it better. But it doesn't come quickly, a change of an attitude of that, and it needs a persistent work and give an example by the public institutions, but then combined efforts from the civil society as well. What I deeply don't accept as an idea is when sometimes scholars are coming up with their recipes that in any given society, and if especially they assess a society that has problems in this direction, that, well, it takes 50 years or maybe 40 years. And there are many who say that the full cycle of actual change requires as much time as few decades to be sustainable. Might be the case, but then if you ask me, if you give that message to people who are actually suffering from corruption, that, okay, maybe some generation in 50 years will have some good results, I don't think that that's an inspirational pitch to give for people to actually push for the reforms. And especially now that with modern techniques, and digital tools that could be introduced in parallel with the institutional changes in this direction, results can be achieved much quicker in much more sustainable way. So my message always in different countries that I come to is that if there is an ambition for the change, it's better to be ambitious for quick changes that could be delivered so that people can see results and trust and be inspired by that, rather than take too much time for planning for decades and more, and then with that lose the momentum when the change could be deliverable, so to say. I'll give you an example of Ukraine. We had the similar example in Georgia, for example, public procurement. Okay, public procurements in corrupt systems are usually very corrupt because there is a lot of money that could be made with the kickbacks, or even further with the schemes, corruption schemes between the public institutions and then private businesses, and especially if it goes very high onto the top of the political ladder. As an example, what emerged in Ukraine, for example, was the combination of changes in all three directions that I mentioned for the prevention. Legal framework was changed, so it was simplified, conducive for transparent way of conducting procurements, because it was previously a jungle, basically, specifically done in the way that you could find loopholes for anything that you would want to if you were in the position of power for any deals in that case, and exemptions from ordinary rules and etc. But then that would not have been sufficient for the quick change. So what emerged was new institution in partnership with Transparency International of Ukraine, as a partnership between the private and public sector, so to say, where new entity emerged for the public procurements. It is called Prozoro in Ukraine, which fully digitalized the process. So it's the blockchain auctioning system now in Ukraine, where any procurements of any size, except for some few exceptions in the security sector, Ukraine is still a war-torn country, unfortunately, because of Russian aggression. So there are some exceptions to that, but procurements from the public institutions, they all have to be done through electronic procurement system, which is an open blockchain system, and fully transparent when it comes from very beginning of the process up until the end. Special monitoring algorithms have been created to monitor the implementation of the system as well, that are placed outside of that agency, so that there is this distancing of that as well. And if there is anything that is malfunctioning in any given procurement, it is being analyzed and then it is being improved of. Financial impact of that change has been enormous for Ukraine when it comes to profitability for the state in terms of its own expenditures, but it has been greatly welcomed, obviously, by the businesses and by the citizens in terms of creating trust that, you know, the big loophole for big corrupt schemes in procurement have actually, it was if not 100% eliminated, you always have to be vigilant to see that nothing malfunctions, but has been transformed profoundly. So what you have as a result of that, you have better roads that are built, you have better schools that are being refurbished, you have better services that are procured by the state institutions and local authorities through the system. Then it developed even further. We've assisted quite a bit local authorities in Ukraine to develop the same systems for leasing of public property and for privatization of public property as well. So now any property that is still under the public ownership, local or central, that is leased for private businesses, usually it's small and medium-sized businesses or advertisement places, all of it is leased and it's transparent, because all of it was fully corrupt previously, because it was a closed system. There was no information what available for lease, which properties. So if you would want to open, let's say, a restaurant in a given city, you would want to have a property combined what was in the private market, what was still leasable from state institutions, and compare the dots. You should have had some connections, you should have bribed somebody in the municipalities or in the central institutions, if depending on the character of the property. And now it's all open. And when it comes to the privatization as well, instead of the deals and then back channels, who would buy what in terms of state properties, it's all open and transparent. And then now it was one of the recent ones was 10 times more for the investment that was generated through the open auctioning system on privatization of one big factory now in Ukraine, rather than it could have ever been previously. So those are the examples. With the small corruption systems as well, It might be surprising for some who've never seen examples of that, but even public registries for businesses, for land, for public services related to registration of marriages, birth certificates, passports. All of that was corrupt previously in the post-Soviet space. In many countries, it is still corrupt. So if you need to get any document on any register or do any registration that you have to do, people had to pay bribes or get some information through the back channels. Now, both in Georgia and Ukraine, all of the systems are digital fully, so that if you need to do any registration of your businesses, any civil acts, if you have to take your identification cards or any document that you have to, you fill in electronically application, you provide documents, everything is open, all of the services are transparent. So even at that level with the petty corruption, which on a scale of a whole country was not petty corruption anymore, cumulatively in terms of how much money was generated through that type of corruption, has been eliminated with that as well. We've seen quite a bit of digital tools applied for transparency reasons by the preventative agencies as well. In Ukraine, for example, all public servants have to supply electronic declarations of their assets. It has been a shock in the society at first when this information came out, how much money some of the public officials owned, and they had to digest that information. But then this precedent emerged that, okay, you, as a baseline, when your first information on your income comes out public, everybody's shocked, but then you have the baseline to compare how much any given public official earns after that. And if it is unjustified, you have clear illicit enrichment cases. So some public officials left their jobs because they understood that either if they can continue for the time being generate illicit income, it's very hard for them to justify that they have it or to spend it properly in that case. So this is a preventative measure that could play well over the time if, as I've mentioned, if measures related to tracing of assets outside of the countries, seizure of those assets is effective, there will be less and less possibilities for public officials to siphon the process of corruption outside of their own countries as well. So I'm just looking into the time, and I guess I've already talked too much. To summarize, perhaps, main takeaway that I wanted to deliver to you is that corruption itself is a very complex phenomenon, very systemic, nothing arbitrary in it, and especially if it's very deep-rooted corruption, as much systemic and comprehensive approach to fighting corruption should be. Fighting corruption can never be successful if it's only driven from outside actors. We've seen that there could be elements that could be manifested in conditionalities, for example, from IFIs like International Monetary Fund or European Union with microfinancial aid when it is being delivered to the countries. But ultimately, it never works if there is no drive and will internally in the countries to deliver change. And if there is this will, and if there are segments of societies or champions of change, an opportunity emerges for the change to be pushed through, as effective, flexible, than the help could be from outside, then more results could be achieved. Momentums of this kind doesn't long too long, because what usually happens, vested interests come out of the shock and then they fight back to any results that anti-corruption reforms could deliver. So as much as one can deliver in as much as short period of time, that's the foundation for more reforms to appear in the future. We see now as an example, for example, new government that came in Moldova. It has been a surprise for many, for them to be able to come in the position of majority in the government, and the new president that is a very strong anti-corruption activist, even when it comes to her mindset. This is the momentum when vested interests are in the process of a shock because they are disoriented. And this is the moment for Moldova, for example, to be helped, for them to deliver as much as possible in this momentum to achieve one pivotal strategic achievement, emerging trust of their own constituencies, electorate, that the change is possible. And I would want to add with that, many societies aspire to have the change. They hope for the change to emerge, but they don't really trust that it's possible if they've suffered for too long with the systemic corruption. I remember very clearly in Georgia, in my own country, when we had the revolution in 2003, it happened because of corruption at the time in the country and stolen elections. And one would think that people already energized, they believed in it, they came to the streets, revolution happened, new government came in with very big public support and demand for change. But we all understood that people didn't believe that it was possible. They were just fed up. They could not tolerate anymore what was happening. And that's how revolution happened. First results had to emerge quickly enough for them to start to believe that actually it is possible, so that police is not harassing them anymore, so they don't have to pay bribes to receive basic administrative services and services from a state that they had to do. So big questions that we've had at the time, what we could deliver quickest, and then build on it so that political capital would not wane too quickly for us to be able then to implement painful reforms, because the time comes when reforms become painful to more than just corrupt people, because in one way or the other, in a short term, they could be affected still negatively. Some people lose jobs, either their relatives or friends or family members. And as I've said, vested interests ultimately come out of the shock and they start to fight back. They have resources, they have experience, so you need to be strong at the time in terms of the public institutions. So not wasting time, acting more rather than thinking what to do in terms of this sequencing. I'm not saying that you need to be spontaneous in whatever you do in terms of fighting corruption, but the main demand and appeal and plea to partners and donors, if they are there to help the developments, is to calibrate assistance in such a way that result-oriented approach emerges, and then results that could be achieved in the short term could pave the way for more sustainable results for the midterm and long term at the end of the day. And tangible results, if they are, nothing is more powerful for energizing society and energize with that electorate that the change is possible. And just to specify, I speak here about countries where democratic processes are possible, rather than countries where elections don't matter, because it's a different terrain, obviously. And then there, the course of action is different when one speaks about how to fight corruption. More of an effort is solely concentrated, perhaps, in maintaining anything in the civil society that one can do, somehow ensuring their security if it is a possibility, or for the countries like, I don't know, Belarus, for example, in our neighborhood, to help those who are in exile to maintain their action so that they can deliver a message and help people who stay inside of the country, and then somehow be an inspiration for them and source of information. I would end with that. I hope that it was not too eclectic, and then I tried to deliver some coherency into what I had to say.
Thank you so much, Eka. Without further ado, I would like to take the questions. First, I will start with Grace, and then Eva, and then Nicholas.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this. I really learned a lot. And I'm Grace. I'm originally from Nigeria, but I grew up in Ireland. But I wanted to ask you, so in Nigeria, there's like a massive corruption issue, right? Can you hear me well?
Yeah, I do.
And last October, there was a protest similar to what happened that you were explaining in 2003, where like young people came out protesting against the particular corruption within the police force. And eventually what happened was there was orders to basically kill these people. So like all the young people came out and they were all shot while they were protesting. And I wanted to ask you, like, what would you recommend for a society that is met with, you know, violence and even more oppression when they do try to speak out, and like the corruption so deeply rooted within like every fiber of society, whether that is the taxi drivers to the people who issue passports to the government at large? Like, what would you recommend a society like that does?
Sure. Maybe I'll collect these 3 questions and then I'll respond in that way, if that's okay with you. Could be more efficient, maybe time-wise.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you can hear me.
I do.
Okay, so my name is Eva and I'm from Kenya. And I think like Nigeria, Kenya suffers the same sort of endemic systemic corruption. And actually, when you're speaking about political will and tolerance, actually, but in my country, we all say we hate corruption, but somehow we tolerate it. However, my question is specifically on what are your views about, if I could say, developed nations trying to tackle corruption in less developed nations through compliance or acts such as the FCPA of the United States. I do agree to a certain extent, unless we come up with an internal solution, I don't think corruption can actually be dealt. So when you have such acts such as FCPA and you're sort of punishing companies, do you think this would create an unfair advantage over some companies? And is it efficient? And secondly, when you have these huge compliance actions and sanctions over companies that have acted corruptly in other foreign nations, they pay hefty fines. They pay fines in the millions and billions of dollars. If you argue that money that has been removed from a country through corruption should be repatriated back to the country, what are your views about DOJ and SEC keeping these huge fines? Do they have a responsibility to share this money or part of this money with the local economies? Because those are the companies, those are the economies that have suffered and have been distorted due to these corrupt actions. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I have a question related to, well, more to human rights and corruption. Recently, there is like a movement, especially in the academia, to say that there is a type of victim that is the victim of corruption. So you consider that there is a specific victim of corruption. It is an individual person. It is all the community that the one that will be victim of it. My question would be, what is your thought about it, that concept of victim of corruption?
One last question, Simba.
Thank you so much for your interesting talk. I wanted to find out, because I see you painted a very broad picture of how technology is being used in places like Ukraine in areas of procurement and other interesting ways. What I wanted to find out is, like, in technology ethics perspective, what are some of the ways you think that governments can actually implement to ensure that, number one, there's transparency over how this technology actually works, and then on board with that. And number two, also from a technology ethics perspective, what do you think should be the role of government in taking accountability for some of the things that technology can do? Because some of these technologies are self-executing. So from an accountability perspective, what do you think the role of government should be? Should it be supervisory, or should it be really ensuring that the final decision is taken by governments? I do agree that technology plays a role, but I think there are other issues that we need to think about for painting such a glowing picture of technology as a way of dealing with this.
Sure. Okay, let me begin from the beginning. I mentioned very briefly at the end that when there is the lack of basic predictability or the meaning into the democratic processes, right? When it comes to the influence that elections could bring, for example, and then the rest, it's a different terrain, obviously, to work with, being inside or outside. But when I'm thinking about that, I think that part of what is very powerful that could only generate from inside is developing the perception of what is good and what is bad, so to say, what is the shameful act and what is not. In 2003, for example, when we've had a revolution, at that time, security forces, we are demoralized. They understood that if they would have undertaken some drastic measures against demonstrators, they would have been outcasts maybe in their own families in many ways. I mean, even the security members and people with the weapons that we are mobilized for some time by the government to act against it. And if you look into the social fabrics, it's a very complex phenomenon, right? So that and it's not, unfortunately, a short-term solution to anything that one can deliver in any country, but until, in that case, it becomes shameful in so many ways and socially unacceptable, so that you would know that if you ultimately participate as a security member in actions like that, then it will be always, there always will be a potential for the political leadership to generate that consolidated action by the security forces against the population. But that's just as an element of that, because we've seen not only in Nigeria, but then we've seen in Eastern Europe, even as I mentioned in Belarus, the situation where security forces have been not very large, for example. They've been very well trained, and they've been consolidated in such a way by the political leadership that for more than a year, Belarus President Lukashenko is able to maintain that grip of power in the country, which is plagued by massive tortures, arrests, and social upheaval. But how long he can sustain that situation now remains to be the question, because irrespective of that, that public disobedience ultimately is not waning away, and people are still coming out in different numbers, but still in the streets. So at the end of the day, if society consolidates perhaps too much, then there is a way of cracking the system. International element of that is an extremely important element as well, because if internal actors who are trying to liberate themselves in that sense are not helped with by international actors, it will be very hard for them only to maintain that drive as well. For example, here now, in the case of Belarus, there are different sanctions that are imposed now on the government. They are not as powerful as to make them crumble right away, but these sanctions are creating an element of restraint right now that is not as effective as it could have been, but it's never easy to go right away with drastic measures when it comes to the sanctions. There are some discrepancies as well. For example, this year IMF had to distribute to all the member states some portions of the money that were due to them as the members. If we speak very plainly on that. And Belarus is a member state, and then it was more than 1 billion, if I'm not mistaken now, that was due to be given to Belarus. And there was a big movement with relation to Venezuela and then with Belarus by public activists that this money should have been withheld, because this money would have been given basically to corrupt dictatorial leadership. But unfortunately, this money to Belarus still went. So the president of Belarus is still able to use these funds, for example. Now, the questions related to fair or unfair, and we have very limited time, I understand, 4 minutes, when restrictions on the businesses. I believe the DOJ has a very good standard when it comes to not returning money until they know how this money will be spent. And I think it is fair, because if the money will be just easily returned back to the countries that they originate, but then if the corrupt leadership is still there and there are no assurances how this money will be spent, you basically give back money to the corrupt elites that originated those money to begin with. So there are elements of criteria that have to be met for the money to be returned. But when it comes to fair or unfair market for the companies that are observing good rules and compliance mechanisms and those who are not, we're very worried. It's a very valid question. I believe that in this case, part of the technique that can be effectively used and is used in some countries to create special funds for the investments, for easy grants for small, medium, or big businesses from the countries that need to comply with good compliance mechanisms, but would have access sometimes even grants, sometimes for easy credits, meaning affordable credits that otherwise they wouldn't have been able to access in their own banking sector. For example, European Investment Bank and EBRD in the European setting are very well developing those mechanisms for business developments, and by that conducive of the new culture and way of operation for businesses, including on environmental front. On IT and technology, nothing is a silver bullet, right, in anything that one does. So when the digitalization processes are developed in any sector, there needs to be special risk mitigation mechanisms set for all reasons. It could be data protection, it could be the decision-making processes and mitigation of corruption risks as well. And they are inherent components of the business processes in the way they need to be developed. We know, for example, with our project conducting now 10 case studies in Ukraine after assessing the first wave of digitalization in different sectors to assess if any corruption risks are still present or not in algorithms, so in the soft developments in the way that they took place, or in application processes of that. And then based on that, the Ministry of Digitalization that who leads here on digitalization processes will be improving the processes, and then will be changing some of the practices in the way how digitalization projects are being developed. But key risks that are associated with digital projects is the security of data, including private data, interoperability of import and export of data for the efficiency reasons, and then to have algorithms that are well calculated that mitigate corruption risks. And for that, you need to understand first, what are the schemes that are applied in those fields for corruption reasons? And while understanding that, to see how digital tools could actually mitigate that by more transparency and, in a good sense, the humanization of interaction of an applicant with the system until the decision-making processes. And on human rights, I'm sorry, I've omitted that. I think that it's a philosophical question, obviously, but I firmly believe that human rights, in terms of at least realization of human rights, if the systems in which a human being exists and lives are corrupt, it's very hard to see how all other rights, civil and political, or social rights that you might have and you have as a human being, could be realized in any predictable way. So I would say that anti-corruption efforts are what makes the rest of human rights, the profound human rights, being realized, rather than freedom of corruption being a right in itself. But that's my personal opinion.
Thank you so much, Eka, and it was a pleasure to have you and students.
Thank you so much, and good luck with your studies, your plans, everything as your endeavors in your future careers.
Wonderful. Thanks again.
Thank you. All the best.
Have a good day now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.